All right, again, good afternoon and welcome to compliance considerations for remote employees. For those of you who are not familiar with MP, MP is a full service human capital management service company. We offer a full suite of products and services, including HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance. We support our clients with cutting edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service and really deep HR and payroll expertise. MP is wired for HR, and we help clients succeed by tying their operations to their business objectives. And with that, I am your presenter today, Sheri. I am one of the HR partners on our HR services team. And we always start out with a legal disclaimer because we are going to be talking a lot about various employment laws today, but this training is intended for educational and informational purposes only. While we do hope you learn a lot today, we are not attorneys and the information should not be construed as legal advice. Okay, with all of that said, first we're going to start with talking about how to determine work location for your remote employees, new hire considerations, state and local wage laws, state and local employment laws. Hopefully we're going to have some time towards the end for a live Q&A. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to send in questions along the way. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of it. And then there's also a page of Department of Labor resources I think you'll find helpful. We will be sending a link to the recording as well as the slide deck to all registered attendees. And with that, let's jump in. So the pandemic has significantly increased the number of remote workers in the United States. In addition, many remote employees have moved out of state from their office locations for personal or financial reasons. So today we are going to be focusing on considerations for hiring remote employees, but there's been an unusual trend of employees moving out of state without letting their employers know. This is just a consideration for those of you who have remote employees. To stay ahead of legal landmines, employers with remote employees should keep track of where employees actually live and work. Ignorance is not a defense against violating employment laws. Employers should frequently check in with remote employees. So how do employers determine work location for their remote employees? What are your obligations for both taxes and employment laws? Before we answer these questions, we need to differentiate between remote workers and employees who telecommute. So remote work and telecommuting are often terms that are often used interchangeably, but there can be small differences between the two. Remote work suggests that the employee is just that, remotely located, while telecommuting, also referred to as telework, can mean that the employee might be working on site some of the time. So for purposes of this presentation, we're primarily going to focus on remote work. All right, so determining work location. Here are some of the questions that you should ask in determining work location. Where is the work being performed? So generally speaking, tax obligations follow the rules of the state where the work is performed, not necessarily where the business is based. So if you have an employee who is a remote worker, you're based in Massachusetts and this employee is in Iowa, that is a true remote employee and their work location would be Iowa. Is remote work temporary or permanent? This is an important question since many remote workers may eventually be returning to the office full-time or in a hybrid model. Excuse me, the length, whether a remote position is temporary or permanent may not be the deciding factor as to where you should list the work location, but it is a consideration. What is the threshold for an income tax nexus? So the term nexus is used in tax law to describe a situation in which a business has a tax presence in a particular state. Employers should be aware that remote working arrangements during the pandemic may inadvertently trigger state payroll registration and filing requirements. When an employee is working outside of the state where the employer operates, the employer may be responsible for the other state's taxes, including income taxes. Each state's income tax and withholding requirements vary significantly and may be based both on personal residence and or work location. So to make it even more complicated, states also have differing thresholds for when an individual working remotely in that state triggers a tax nexus. So for example, in Illinois, that threshold is 30 days, while in New York State, it's 14 days. Next question would be, is remote work an option or a requirement? So the general rule for state withholding is that the tax should be withheld where the employee works. However, if the employee is exercising an option to work from home part of their work week, then the employer may not be required to withhold taxes from the employee's state of residence. This happens frequently with employers who are located near border states, such as New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine. So if you have an employee, if you're based in Massachusetts, you have an employee who lives in Southern Maine and does maybe commute to the office a couple days a week, comes in for meetings, but predominantly works from home, that work location very likely could be that base of operation, or where the business is based. Excuse me. Is there a reciprocity agreement? So some states that border each other have entered into agreements related to allowing an employee who lives in one state but works in a neighboring state to have their withholding tax paid to either the state where the employee works or the state in which they live. So for an example, an employee who lives in Maryland but commutes to Northern Virginia or DC for their job can have their withholding tax paid to Maryland rather than the work state, because they have a reciprocity agreement. Currently, there are 16 states in the District of Columbia with reciprocity agreements. So these are all questions you should be asking yourself in order to determine where that work location is. So state and unemployment jurisdiction. In determining work location for the purposes of unemployment insurance, the U.S. Department of Labor has created a set of rules to guide employers on which state to remit SUI, or state unemployment insurance payments. That is generally, we like to say that's a good rule of thumb for determining what the work location should be, and therefore where you should be paying taxes and following employment laws. So that unemployment, that unemployment responsibility really is a good jumping off point to determine work location. So first off, Department of Labor says it looks at localization of services. So I'm sorry, the following factors that we're going to review, they should be used in consecutive order to determine the current state. So localization of services, this is where the employee works the majority of the time. If it is determined that the employee's services are localized within a state, the SUI for that employee is reported to that state, and the additional factors don't have to be considered. So again, you're based in Massachusetts, you've got an employee who lives and works from home in Iowa. Localization of services is what comes into play. This is where you're going to be expected to remit your SUI payments to the state of Iowa, and also consider that the work locations, which has all the other tax and employment law implications. So base of operations, this is where the employee has a base of operations and performs some services. So if the service is not localized, so if number one doesn't apply, excuse me, but the base of operations and some of the service is performed within the state, then the employee's entire service should be reported to this state. So a good example of this would be a sales rep who maybe reports to the office once a week or twice a week, but is on the road the remainder of the week or working from home. In this case, the base of operations would be the office location, and therefore that is the state you would report, you would remit your SUI payments to. The third consideration would be place of direction and control. Now, I know a lot of employers use this as the definitive way to decide where the work location is where the direction and control is coming from. But as you can see from this Department of Labor set of guidelines, it really isn't the primary determination. So place of direction and control is where the employee receives direction and control from the employer and performs some services. So if the employee's work is not localized and there's no base of operations, but there is direction or control in one of the states where the employee performs services, then the entire service should be reported to this state. Number 4 would be residence. This is where the employee resides and performs some of their services. In rare instances where none of the 3 previous factors can be applied, then the state of the employee's residence will have jurisdiction. And then finally, and as discussed before, there's this reciprocal agreements. If the states have reciprocity, the employer can sometimes choose the state of coverage. So now that we've hopefully determined what our work location is, let's talk a little bit about new hire considerations. So you've determined proper work location, and there are a number of things to consider in regards to the various state and local laws that impact recruiting and onboarding, as well as applicable wage and employment laws. So first, let's start with these new hire considerations. So there are a number of considerations when recruiting remote employees. One of the first things you need to do is make sure that your job applications are compliant in all 50 states. There are more than 20 states and a number of cities that prohibit employers from asking about salary history on employment applications and or during the interview process. So you want to make sure that if you're using an application to cover any state, you want to make sure that you're not asking about salary history on applications. In addition, there are currently 14 states and 20 cities and counties that have banned the box laws, which prohibit employers from asking about criminal history on employment applications. So the other consideration is in drug testing. So for those of you who do drug testing as a condition of employment, you may want to consider exceptions for off-duty marijuana use. Although it's still illegal at the federal level, there are 36 states in the District of Columbia that allow the use of medical marijuana, and 19 states plus the District of Columbia that have legalized recreational marijuana use. Many of these state laws have protections built in for medical and or off-duty marijuana use, where you can't discriminate against somebody based on that use. So again, these are just things to consider when you're getting started recruiting remote employees. All right, now we're going to move on to the onboarding process. So we've made the offer. We're gonna bring on some remote employees. One of the first things we need to do as part of new hire paperwork is the Form I-9. So employers are expected to verify employment eligibility by reviewing original documents in person when completing the employer portion of the I-9. The Immigration Reform and Control Act does not permit employers to use copies or pictures of documents to verify employment eligibility, nor can they use video technology. This really does present unique challenges, of course, for remote employees. So in order to comply with the I-9 requirements, an employer can designate someone local to act as an agent to review the documents or complete the employer portion of the I-9. There are services available throughout the country to take care of this task for you, or you can use any notary. You can just call usually you can call any local bank that you do business with and arrange for a notary where a new hire can go in, bring their employment verification documents into the notary and have them fill out that portion of the I-9. Another consideration is workers' compensation. So states generally require that the employer register for and obtain workers' comp insurance in the state where the employee is performing the services. So it's really important to contact your workers' comp carrier or broker to make sure your remote employees are covered under the workers' comp policy. So workers' comp rates do vary by state. So you want to make sure you have your employees' work location set with your workers' comp carrier. Some states like Ohio, for example, actually require separate state workers' comp policy for remote workers. Very important to make sure you've got that covered. You don't think about workers' comp issues for remote employees, but they do come up. Another thing to consider is disability insurance. There are a number of states that require employers to participate in state disability programs. Some states like New York require employers to provide this benefit through their insurance carrier, while others like New Jersey are provided by the state. So you want to make sure what your obligations are for disability insurance. The fourth consideration on onboarding is direct deposit. Many states do not allow employers to require employees to get paid via direct deposit. And in addition, there are some state laws regarding the use of pay cards for those employees who don't have direct deposit. So state laws vary considerably. So it's really important, again, to be aware of the laws in the state in which you have employees working. And then finally, the state withholding forms. So most states have their own withholding forms that need to be included in your new hire package. As a default, a lot of employers just use the same deductions for state as they do for the federal W-2. However, if anybody has filled out a W-2 recently, you know that has changed significantly. And there's no longer a number of exemptions that you're claiming. It's actually dollar amounts. So that's not going to translate to most of the state withholding forms. So now it's becoming more important to make sure that the employee fill out both the federal W-2 and the state withholding form. All right, so some of you may have heard about I-9 flexibility during the pandemic. Back on March 20th, 2020, due to precautions implemented by employers and employees associated with COVID-19, the Department of Homeland Security announced that it would defer the physical presence requirement associated with the Form I-9. Please note that this policy only applies to employers and workplaces that are operating remotely due to COVID-19. So if there are employees physically present at a work location, no exceptions are being implemented at this time for in-person verification of identity and employment eligibility docs. Due to the continued precautions related to COVID-19, DHS has extended this policy until December 31st, 2021. So again, it's really important if, let's say, for example, I know here at MP, some of us are back to the office, but we do have employees in 17 different states. So because we are not operating fully remotely due to COVID-19, we still have to meet those requirements for the physical verification of documents related to the I-9. All right, next up is state wage and hour laws. Excuse me, that employers need to be aware of when you hire remote employees. All right, first is pay frequency. So every state has different requirements for pay frequency. States like Connecticut, for example, only allow for weekly pay frequency unless there is a waiver from the labor commissioner. Some states like Massachusetts require non-exempt employees to be paid on a weekly or biweekly basis, but they do permit exempt employees to be paid less frequently. States also have different requirements as to when employees must be paid after the close of the pay period. Again, here in Massachusetts, where employers are required to pay employees within 6 days of the close of the pay period. Other states are within 2 weeks, some are within 7 or 8 days. So it is really important to make sure that your pay frequency is compliant in the new states in which you're going to be operating. And one side note to that is that if you do, let's say you're in a state that does allow semi-monthly pay, and that's how you pay, and then you start hiring employees in states that require at minimum bi-weekly pay frequency. Some states, Massachusetts is one of them, require written notice. Here in Mass, you actually have to provide 90 days written notice when you're going to be changing pay frequency. So it's really important to make sure you are up to date on any state and local wage laws regarding pay frequency. Next up is minimum wage. So minimum wage laws not only vary by state, but a number of cities and counties have varying minimum wage requirements. So for example, in California, there are 30 cities, 30, you heard that right, with their own minimum wage requirements. Some minimum wage laws even vary by the number of employees, whether you have under 25 or over 25 employees. So it is, again, really important if you have minimum wage workers that you are aware of the minimum wage requirements in the states in which you're hiring employees. Next up is overtime. Overtime pay requirements also differ by state. So under federal law, overtime has to be paid for all hours worked in excess of 40 hours in a work week. However, in California, for example, non-exempt employees have to be paid overtime for any hours over 8 hours worked in a work day. So again, really important to be aware of the overtime requirements in the different states. Next is employee classification. And I'm talking about whether you're classifying somebody as exempt, meaning exempt from overtime pay laws, or non-exempt, which is usually how we refer to as hourly employees, but non-exempt employees can be paid a salary as well, but still have to be paid overtime. So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, there are specific requirements in order to classify an employee as exempt from overtime pay, which include the salary basis, salary threshold, and duties tests. However, many states have more stringent requirements. So at the federal level, the salary threshold for an exempt employee is $35,568. So in California, the exempt salary threshold is $54,080. In New York State, the threshold is $48,750, while in New York City, the threshold for exempt employees is $58,500. So as you can see, even if you're complying at the federal level, if the state level provides better benefit to the employee, then state law would trump federal law, and you would have to comply with the state law. So if you've got exempt employees that you're hiring around the country, and in your base state, you're paying, say, $45,000 a year, but then you hire somebody to do the same work in California, New York City, you'll have to make sure that their salaries are increased in order to make sure that you're complying with those state laws for exempt employees. And finally, want to think about final wage payments. I know when we're hiring people, we're not thinking about also letting them go, but it is really important to know when you do have to terminate somebody, what those final wage payment requirements are, or if somebody just resigns. So it's not a surprise by now that final wage requirements also differ by state. Many states differentiate final pay requirements depending on whether the termination is voluntary or involuntary. So in Massachusetts, for example, employees who are involuntarily terminated must be paid at time of termination. So when you're letting them go, you got to have that check in hand. But for voluntary terminations in Massachusetts, you can pay them on the next regularly scheduled payday. In New Hampshire, an employee who quits and gives at least one pay period's notice actually has to be paid within 72 hours of termination. So in addition to the final pay, a lot of states require written notices or termination letters, as well as unemployment information or brochures to be provided at time of termination. So again, it doesn't matter whether it's a voluntary termination or involuntary termination. It's really important to know what those final wage requirements are. All right, so because state employment laws vary widely, legal compliance can quickly become complicated when remote workers move around the country. A regional employer that has only had to comply with one state's employment laws may suddenly have to comply with laws of another state and potentially the laws of many other states. So again, very important as you're hiring remote workers to be cognizant of all of the state and local employment laws. So let's talk about a few of the things that you need to consider in regards to employment laws. So employers should be mindful that the employment laws of the state where the remote employee is working generally will apply to that employment relationship. So let's take a look at some of those employment laws that employers should be aware of when hiring remote employees. So first of our employment posters. Employers are required to post various federal, state, and local employment laws. Usually you're going to have one nice big all-in-one federal and state employment poster that you're going to put up in the break room or someplace in the office where everybody can see it. However, this doesn't really work for your remote employees. So for remote employees, you can either post those notices or federal posters and state posters electronically on an intranet site, for example, or you can email them to the remote employees. You don't necessarily have to have them put them up in their living rooms, but you definitely have to have them available so they know what employment laws apply to them. Also, there are a lot of required notices. So many states have notices that have to be provided to employees at hire. So some of these notices can be included in your employee handbook to satisfy the requirement, but others actually need to be given to a new employee at hire. So for example, here in Massachusetts, employers have to provide notices at hire for paid family and medical leave, for the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, and for earned sick time. In California, there are actually 9 required notices for new hires. So again, making sure that you know what states your employees are working in and what notices have to be given out. Excuse me. Local and state leaves. So this is getting more and more complicated as more and more states, cities, and counties are putting various leave laws into play. So many state and local laws require employers to provide paid and or unpaid time off for sick time, parental leave, domestic violence leave, family and medical leave, and a host of other job protected leaves. So it's very important to make sure you know what applies to your employees and to make sure you're complying. So let me give you a good example. In Massachusetts, you know that we have earned sick time and everybody has to accrue at least 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, up to a maximum of 40 hours. Well, California, for example, California, they have to accrue up to 48 hours. And in addition to that, excuse me, in addition to that, they have to be able to carry over that 48 hours. And one other caveat to the California law is that the accruals have to be shown on the pay stubs. Not a requirement here in Massachusetts, but it is a requirement in California. These are the little nuances when it comes to leaves that you want to make sure you're aware of. Also, harassment training. Currently, California, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, New York State, and New York City require harassment prevention training for employees and managers. Some of these trainings have to be a minimum of 1 hour or 2 hours. Many of them have to be done on an annual basis or biannual basis. So it's really important, again, to know what laws and what trainings are required in the states in which you have employees. All right. Reimbursable expenses. This one's getting even more confusing. So employers need to determine whether expenses such as equipment, internet, cell phones, etc., need to be reimbursed. So currently, there are 10 states in the District of Columbia that have enacted laws requiring employers to reimburse employees for certain remote work expenses. So for example, in California, employers are required to reimburse employees for all necessary expenditures or losses incurred by the employee as a direct consequence of the discharge of his or her duties. Well, this law has been interpreted to require employers to reimburse employees for a reasonable percentage of their monthly internet or mobile phone bill for work-related uses, even in instances where the employee has an unlimited wireless plan or where their internet bill doesn't increase based on usage. So it's, again, very important to know because employees who are working remotely oftentimes have to, again, maybe upgrade their internet or upgrade their cell phone service in order to be able to do their jobs. So again, every state's going to vary. Very important to know which states have those requirements for reimbursable expenses. And again, this is going to differ too for those. And again, I know we're talking about hiring remote employees, but for those employees in a hybrid environment. So if you, again, you're based in Massachusetts and you've got an employee who lives in New Hampshire and they have the option to work from home. So most of the time they work from home, but their work location is where their company is located in Massachusetts. They get their direction from their main office. They oftentimes come in for meetings and other reasons to work in the office. Those employees may not necessarily be required to have expenses reimbursed, while an employee who is truly remote, doesn't commute into the office, would have to have some expenses reimbursed. All right, so hopefully I haven't totally dissuaded you from hiring remote employees. The benefits of remote workers really often outweigh some of the challenges. So one of the big benefits for employers of remote work is the cost savings. such as rent, utilities, building maintenance, cleaning, equipment, and furniture. A lot of employers, once they went remote because of COVID, realized that remote works. There's so many industries where we never thought remote work was even a consideration. And now we're realizing, hey, this works well, and our employees like it. So if the employees like it and it's working well for us, let's keep it going. But in doing so, they've realized that they don't need the same amount of office space that they had before. They're reducing the amount of money they're spending on coffee in the office or bringing in lunches and things like that. So there can really be some serious cost savings to hiring remote employees. The other big advantage is increasing your pool of talent, because once you are opening up positions that can work remote to everybody in the country rather than just in your local area, you have so many more options for applicants. The other big benefit of remote workforce is reduce absenteeism. You know, if somebody's not feeling up to par and doesn't really feel like working, you know, doesn't feel like they can be in the office today, maybe, you know, they get some congestion and a cough and they're not sure if they're coming down with something. And they would, if they're not a remote worker, if they work in an office or in a manufacturing environment or retail store, they might be inclined to call out sick. But somebody who's working from home oftentimes can work under those conditions. So you actually can reduce absenteeism. Sometimes people have to take time off, request time off, or call out because of emergencies at home. You've got a water heater that's burst, or you've got some maintenance that's going to be done. For remote workers, they can make all of that work around their workday. So again, reduces absenteeism. And most studies have shown that working from home actually increases productivity. When you're in the office, and I know personally I have found this for sure because I used to be office-based, and right now I am still working remotely. When I'm in the office, as much as I love working with my coworkers, there's so many more distractions in the office, so many more people coming up to your desk or walking into your office saying, hey, can I ask you a question? Can you help me with this? Those interruptions kind of go away. So there's a lot more increased productivity from remote workers. And then finally, and most importantly, it can really lead to improved employee retention. So all in all, there's a lot of benefits from remote work that are realized than some of the issues that you have to contend with. So let's see what kind of questions we've gotten in so far. All right, let me see. Is this only for new hires, or if a current employee moves to California, for example, would they need to be given these notices? So it's a great question. So yes. So if you have an employee who's currently based in Massachusetts, working remotely, and again, especially during the pandemic, a lot of employees who went to remote work said, why am I going to be sitting here in my apartment all by myself when I could go back to California, Florida, Iowa, wherever their family's from, and then work in a bubble that I can then be with my friends and family. So yes, so if an employee moves out of state from where your office is located and moves to a new state, if there are any notices that are required, any posters that you will be required to put up, all of that, you definitely do need to provide that once they move. This is really important for those of you who have remote workers now, to make sure that you know where your remote workers are moving to. So whether you do maybe a quarterly check-in, or twice a year check-in, or at least make sure your managers and supervisors are aware. They're probably the first ones to know if an employee is moving to a new state, because they're usually talking to their manager or supervisor, and might have to take a day off, a couple of days off to move. So if the manager or supervisor knows, somebody needs to let HR know, to make sure that we change the work location, number one. We make sure we're paying taxes to the right state, that we're withholding the proper taxes from the employee. And oftentimes this might also have implications for benefits. So when somebody moves to a new state, that actually is a trigger for somebody to possibly change their insurance, maybe to make changes to their FSA, And it may be that, let's say you're in one location and you offer an HMO, and then you have an employee that moves out of state, you may now have to add a PPO policy to your plan. So all of those things are really important to consider. All right, what other kind of questions do we have come in? All right, we recently hired an employee who lives in Virginia, but visits our headquarters in Mass as needed to support their team. Is this still considered a hybrid employee or remote employee? So again, when they are really out of state, they're not commuting. They're just maybe coming in a couple times a year, maybe once a month. The bulk of their work is being done in Virginia. Virginia then is the work state. Think of that list from the Department of Labor. Localization of services would come in first and foremost, even if they're just coming in once in a while, excuse me, for meetings in your headquarters in Massachusetts. Workers' comp dilemma. Is an employer liable for a worker who trips and falls while working at home? How do you police this? Is there a requirement to inspect their home workplace? So this is a great question for your workers' comp carrier. And yes, it is possible that a remote worker who has an accident at home might be covered under your workers' comp plan. It's important. One of the best practices is to make sure that you have a remote work agreement. And in a remote work agreement, you're going to outline the expectations for a home office. So you want to make sure that the home office, that the employee has sufficient internet service, that the employee has limited distractions in order to complete their work, things like that. And you want to make sure that you're providing them any of the tools, resources, equipment that they need. So if somebody needs, say, an ergonomic mouse or an ergonomic chair, you may be required to provide that. And yes, if somebody has, let's say, for example, if somebody develops back problems because they are sitting all the time, working remotely, that could be covered under workers' comp. So you may consider a sit-stand desk arrangement that you provide them. So yeah, how you police that is a darn good question. There are no requirements, to the best of my knowledge, to inspect home workspace, but it's a good idea to have some guidelines that you're providing employees. Excuse me. One of the questions that has come up with one of my clients is that this is a client that is a retail store. They have stores in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. They had an employee who lived in Maine but worked in a New Hampshire location. That employee was insistent that they have their Maine taxes withheld instead of New Hampshire taxes. However, the work location is what determines what taxes the employer and the employee are obligated to pay. So the employer really does not have to register as an employer in Maine and withhold those taxes. They could choose to do so if they wanted to for the convenience of the employee, but it is not required. You're only required to withhold the taxes from the state in which they work. Excuse me. All right, let me see if we got any other questions coming in. All right, that looks like the bulk of our questions. So here's a few resources. The Department of Labor has a few really good resources for you if you are trying to find information about state laws. You can, from this one site, you can get to the State Department of Labor offices and sites. There's also a link for the minimum wage laws in the various states, which will also include pay frequency. And then state payday requirements are also, there's also a link there on the Department of Labor's website that I would encourage you to check out. Any other questions that come up, please feel free to send us an email at mp-hr.com. I'm sorry, marketing@mp-hr.com. And one of us will reply back to you. And again, we are going to be sending out a copy of the recording and the slide deck. So thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.